Nineveh and its remains, with an account of a visit to the Chaldæan Christians of Kurdistan and the Yezidis, or devil worshippers, and an inquiry into the manners and arts of the ancient Assyrians, by Austen Henry Layard, Esquire, DCL. This is the man who went to that area, went to Nineveh, apparently, and discovered, then unearthed, the library of Ashurbanipal, having 50,000 cuneiform tablets in it. He shipped them to the British Museum, where they are today. And the native-born Aramaic translator Victor Alexander apparently travelled there. He went to the British Museum and the Louvre in Paris and looked at those cuneiform tablets and so forth. This is the second edition. It comes in 2 volumes, and this is volume 1. And this looks like it was printed and published in 1849 or later. To Benjamin Austen, Esquire, these volumes, and affectionately dedicated. So maybe that was his son or his brother or somebody like that, somebody related to him. Preface. It is with considerable diffidence that I, the author, venture to submit the following narrative to the reader. The opinions of friends and a desire on his part to communicate the little information that opportunities may have enabled him to acquire with regard to a country and city so little known as Assyria and Nineveh had alone induced him to undertake a work of this nature under the united disadvantages of incapacity, literary inexperience, ill health, and a very short residence in England. When he adds that he had at the same time been engaged in preparing for the press illustration or illustrated work on the monuments of Nineveh, and in superintending the publication for the trustees of the British Museum of the cuneiform inscriptions brought by him from Assyria, occupations which demanded considerable time and care, he felt that he might have to appeal with more confidence to the kind indulgence of his readers, and particularly of those who were far more competent at that particular time than himself to enter into the inquiries he ventured to add to his personal narrative. A general dissertation such as that contained in the second volume requires a very extensive acquaintance with those ancient and modern authors who have written or casually touched upon similar subjects. The necessity of a residence in the country and the consequent absence of books prevented him from consulting many works which might have afforded valuable information, and it rendered it difficult the verification of quotations obtained in many instances during hurried visits to London. With more time and opportunities at his command, this dissertation might have been rendered more entertaining and useful. He should not have added it to the narrative, he says, had he not felt that there were many observations which could only have occurred to one engaged, like himself, in a very close examination of the ruins of Assyria, and which, right or wrong, should be recorded, if recorded at all, while still fresh in his memory. He felt that perhaps he may venture to hope that although those general remarks may be of little value, they would at least afford some assistance to others who might engage in similar inquiries. Him being anxious to avoid entering upon debatable subjects, it was originally his intention to state merely the results of his researches, but as he proceeded with his work he found it necessary to touch upon topics connected with Assyrian history and chronology. This was almost indispensable, he felt, in order to give the reader an idea of the extent of the discoveries and of the arguments they furnish. The opinions, however, which he had ventured to offer must be considered rather in the light of suggestions. Many things that have appeared to him, or had appeared to him, to be facts may require further proof before they can be generally admitted. An examination of the ruins of Syria was still unexplored at the time, and a fuller acquaintance with the monuments and inscriptions already discovered by him were required to enable him and his assistant, or his friend, to arrive at satisfactory results in an inquiry such as he has entered into in this book. They ventured into or entered into. Still, it appeared to him that they had already sufficient data to warrant the attempt. And he has these words of caution which he felt were necessary. He trusted the reader would acquit him of any wish to mislead him, or to make more of his subject than it deserves. Making a mountain out of a molehill, in other words. With regard to his personal narrative, he may owe an apology to the reader for introducing subjects not included in the title of his work, for adding narratives of his visits to the Tiari and Yezidis, and a dissertation upon the Chaldeans of Kurdistan. He thought that it might not be uninteresting to give such a slight sketches of manners and customs as would convey a knowledge of the condition and history of the present inhabitants of the country, particularly of those who there is good reason to presume are descendants of the ancient Assyrians. They are, indeed, as much the remains of Nineveh and Assyria as are the rude heaps and ruined palaces. A comparison between the dwellers in the land as they now are, at that particular time, and as the monuments of their ancestors lead us to believe they once were, will not or would not perhaps be without useful results. It may have given rise to serious reflection and may even have proven an instructive lesson. He states here that he had to prepare the reader for such inaccuracies and defects in his narrative as may arise from haste and inexperience. He preferred sketches conveying a general idea of his operations and adventures to mere dry details, and a continuous relation of incidents which might have led him into frequent repetitions. In spelling Eastern names, he has followed no uniform system, having endeavoured to write them in the best way he could, to convey the mode of their pronunciation by the people of the country. This, he was fully aware, is contrary to the plan he generally adopted, but he had not time to reduce the Oriental words in various languages to one standard. He has introduced into these volumes as many illustrations of the sculptures and monuments as he conveniently could. Carefully, elaborately engravings of the bas-reliefs and objects discovered would be published separately in a larger work on the monuments of Nineveh, which, he felt, may therefore be considered illustrative of those volumes. He said it was a pleasing duty to acknowledge kindness and assistance in such labours as these, and it is with gratitude. He goes on about all these different people, thanking them for their input, their suggestions, their help, etc. And he says, in recording a liberality unfortunately so rare, he became an additional witness to the noble support that these people gave him, right, to literature and science, or towards literature and science. But it was regretted that proper steps had not been taken for the transport to England of these sculptures discovered at Nineveh, those which had already reached that country, and it was to be feared those which were on their way were consequently might suffer unnecessary injury or damage. The great winged bull and lion, which he had hoped would have speedily formed an important portion of the national collection, was still lying at Busra, and there was little prospect at that time of their being brought or taken to England, right? Surely British ingenuity and resources cannot, as is pretended, be unable to remove objects which have already, with very inadequate means, been transported nearly 1,000 miles. The cases containing the small objects recently that were deposited in the British Museum were not only opened without authority at Bombay, India, but their contents exhibited or shown off without proper precautions to the public. It was remarkable that several of the most valuable, indeed the most valuable, specimens were missing, and the whole collection was so carelessly repacked that it sustained very material injury. Were these Assyrian relics, however valuable, such as could be again obtained, you couldn't get a replacement, right? Either by ingenuity or labour, their loss might not perhaps be so seriously lamented or cried over, but if once destroyed, they could never be returned. well, never be restored. And it must be remembered that they are almost the only remains of a great city and of a great nation. Cheltenham, October 1848, says writing from England. We went back there. Introduction. Before submitting the following narrative of his labours in Assyria to the reader, he felt that it may not be uninteresting to give a slight sketch of what had been done in the field of Assyrian antiquities previous to the recent discoveries he made on the site of Nineveh. The history of Assyria had been written by Herodotus and Ctesias. Unfortunately, the work of the former, who was so scrupulous in recording facts and traditions, has been entirely lost. Not a fragment of it has been preserved by those who, it may be presumed, might have made use of it, and who quote largely from him on similar subjects. This fact has led modern critics to doubt whether Herodotus did really write an Assyrian history, although Aristotle mentions having seen it. It's got down the bottom here a small note, footnote, or whether he merely alludes to a projected undertaking. Did such a work exist, there is little doubt that we should possess a very complete history of Assyria, as Herodotus considered the subject of sufficient interest and importance to demand a separate treatise. This design of writing a distinct account of the Assyrians has unfortunately led him to omit or leave out all mention of that nation in his great work. We might otherwise have derived much information from casual notices, similar to those which he has introduced respecting the Egyptians and other remarkable nations of antiquity. Almost the only allusion he makes to an event in Assyrian history, the sudden spread of the Assyrian power over Asia, apparently involves as an assertion in direct contradiction to all that we find elsewhere recorded of the antiquity and origin of the Assyrian Empire. Of the history of Ctesias, only a few fragments have been preserved, chiefly in the works of Diodorus, Siculus and Photius. He was a native of Cnidus, who, either as a prisoner or a traveller, found himself at the Persian capital. Being skilled in medicine, he was taken into favour by the king and remained 17 years at his court, where he was treated with great distinction. During his residence in Persia, he was able to consult the public archives, and he compiled from them a history of the Persians and of their predecessors in the Empire of Asia. Diodorus, maybe, it's got down the bottom there. It's a reference to him, something he stated. He also wrote an account of India and its productions. The absurd exaggerations and fables which it contains have caused all his other works to be viewed with suspicion. He is likewise accused of being led by extreme jealousy of Herodotus into direct misstatements, that he may contradict that historian. Aristotle more than once declares him to be unworthy of credit. And modern critics have generally agreed to reject altogether or to receive with great reserve all his assertions. Yet Diodorus, Siculus and several ancient authors appear to have followed and trusted him, and it may be observed that whilst mere travellers' tales and vulgar traditions were probably the only sources of his Indian marvels, written records and monuments may have furnished him with well authenticated historical facts to assist him in compiling the history of the country in which he resided and of which he had a personal knowledge. Unfortunately, of his history very little remains except the names of kings. Much relating to Assyria contained in the works of others was, however, undoubtedly copied from him. Of later writers who have touched upon Assyrian history, Diodorus Siculus, a mere compiler, is the principal. Eusebius and the Armenian historians such as Moses of Corinth have preserved a few valuable details and hints. They also obtained their information from elsewhere, but in some instances from original sources not altogether devoid of authenticity. Many other authors could be cited who have casually in their works alluded to events in Assyrian history, or have introduced brief notices concerning the Assyrian empires, but any particular account of them or an analysis of the information they afford would only weary the reader. And down the bottom here he has put that he may mention Berosus, Abydos, Strabo, Nicolaus of Damascus, Castor, Polyhistor, Justin, Suidas, and the Alice or Syncalis. Abdinus gives a list of kings differing from those of Eusebius and the Syncalis or Syncalis. It is remarkable that none of the authors alluded to do more than mention by name any of the Assyrian kings, with the exceptions of the three great monarchs, Ninus, Semiramis, and Sardanapalus, whom traditions have made celebrated, and whose deeds, like those of all prominent characters in an epoch before sober history commenced, have been invested with superhuman features, or have been mixed up with fables. Yet above 30 generations elapsed between Ninus and Sardanapalus, during which a whole line of kings occupied the Assyrian throne and maintained the power of the empire. Their names have been handed down to us in genealogical series by Eusebius, the Syncalis, and others, but the lists themselves are more than doubtful and are generally believed to furnish sufficient evidence against their own authenticity. With regard to Ninus and Semiramis, the author needed only here mention that, like all heroes of primitive history and early tradition, their names appear to have become conventional, and all great deeds and national events being assigned to them. Originally historic characters, they have been to some extent invested with divine attributes, and have been mixed up with the theology of the race of which they were the first monarchs. This leads to a well-known result, the hero worship of ancient nations. Still, in admitting this fact, we must guard against rejecting traditions simply because they are connected with these names. Many have a foundation and were probably derived from events which actually took place. It is the province of the critical inquirer to separate the mythic from that which comes within the legitimate bounds of history, to trace the origin of fables and to draw rational conclusions from them. The Assyrians are not particularly alluded to in Holy Writ or Holy Writings until the period when their warlike expeditions to the west of the Euphrates brought them into contact with the Jews. The first king whose name is recorded was Pul, who reigned between 800 and 900 years before the Christian era, and about 200 previous to the fall of the empire. Consequently, he must have been nearly the last of a long succession of kings who, it is generally admitted, had ruled over the greater part of Asia. The later monarchs are more frequently mentioned in the Bible as their conquest over the Jews, whom they led captive into Assyria, brings them continually under notice. But except when they particularly concern the Jewish people, very little is related of the deeds of even these monarchs. Of modern historians who have attempted to reconcile the discrepancies of Assyrian chronology and to restore, to some extent, from the fragments to which the author has alluded, a history of the Assyrian Empire, he scarcely knew whom to point to, and he goes into that for a few more pages. And there's one that's copied badly, so you can't read that. So I'm going to skip all that. Contents, the first volume. Nineveh and its remains, chapter 1. First journey in Assyria, its ruins, Koyunik, Nimrud, and Kala Shukhat in Bottas discoveries. Khorsabad returned to Mosul. During the autumn of 1839 and winter of 1840, he had been wandering through Asia Minor and Syria, scarcely leaving untrod one spot hallowed by tradition or unvisited one ruin consecrated by history. He was accompanied by one no less curious and enthusiastic than himself. They were both equally careless of comfort and unmindful of danger. They rode it alone, their arms were their only protection, or their guns, whatever they had, their weapons. A valise behind their saddles was their wardrobe, and they tended their own horses, except when relieved from the duty by the hospitable inhabitants of a Turcoman village or an Arab tent. Thus, unembarrassed by needless luxuries and uninfluenced by the opinions and prejudices of others, they mixed among the people, acquired without effort their manners, and enjoyed without alloy those emotions which seem so novel, and spots so rich in varied association cannot fail to produce. He looks back with feelings of grateful delight to those happy days when free and unheeded, and he left at dawn a humble cottage or cheerful tent, and lingering as they listed, unconscious of distance and of the hour, found themselves as the sun went down under some hoary ruin tenanted by the wandering Arab, or in some crumbling villages still bearing a well-known name. No experienced dragoman measured their distance and appointed their stations. They were honoured with no conversations by pashas, nor did they seek any civilities from governors. They neither drew tears nor curses from villagers by seizing their horses or searching their houses for provisions. Their welcome was sincere, their scanty fare was placed before them. They ate and came and went in peace. They had traversed Asia Minor and Syria, visiting the ancient seats of civilization and the spots which religion has made holy. He at the time felt an irresistible desire to penetrate to the regions beyond the Euphrates, to which history and tradition point as the birthplace of the wisdom of the West. Most travellers, after a journey through the usually frequented parts of the East, have the same longing to cross the great river and to explore those lands which are separated on the map from the confines of Syria by a vast blank stretching from Aleppo to the banks of the Tigris. A deep mystery hangs over Assyria, Babylonia and Chaldæa. With these names are linked great nations and great cities, dimly shadowed forth in history, mighty ruins in the midst of deserts, defying by their very desolation and lack of definite form the descriptions of the traveller, the remnants of mighty races still roving over the land, the fulfilling and fulfilment of prophecies, the plains to which the Jew and the Gentile alike look as the cradle of their race. After a journey in Syria, the thoughts naturally turned eastward, and without treading on the remains of Nineveh and Babylon, their pilgrimage was incomplete. He left Aleppo with his companion on the 18th of March. They still travelled as they had been accustomed, without guide or servants. And goes on about that. They preferred that through Bur and Orpha. That's probably Edessa, the Arabic for Edessa, Urfa or Orpha. And he talks about different things, different stays in different places. And he talks about Xenophon, a line of lofty mountains bounded it to the east, and one of a pyramidical form rose above the high above the rest. Beyond it could be faintly traced the waters of the Zab. Its position rendered its identification easy. This was the pyramid which Xenophon had described, and near with which the 10,000 had encamped. The ruins around it were those which the Greek general saw 22 centuries before, and which were even then the remains of an ancient city. Although Xenophon had confounded a name spoken by a strange race with one familiar to a Greek ear, and had called the place Larissa, tradition still points to the origin of the city, and by attributing its foundation to Nimrud, whose name the ruins now bear, connect it with one of the first settlements of the human race. And here's a footnote indicator, and underneath it says these ruins include the great mounds of Koyunchik and Nebi Yunus. He, Nimrud, went out into Assyria and builded Nineveh, the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and reasoned between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. Genesis 10, 11, 12. The ruins of Nimrud had been identified with reason, of which Larissa was believed, first by Balkart, to bear corruption arising from the presumed use by the inhabitants of the country of the common Shemitic article al before the word. It may be observed in the first place that the philological grounds are inadequate, and in the second that if this were Resen, no room would be left for the site of Nineveh, a still greater city. So he has here, it supposedly was one of the first settlements of the human race. Calah Shugert, like Nimrud, was an Assyrian ruin, a vast shapeless mass, now covered with grass and showing scarcely any traces of the work of man, except where the winter rains had formed ravines down its almost perpendicular sides, and had thus laid open its contents. A few fragments of pottery and inscribed bricks discovered after a careful search amongst the rubbish which had accumulated around the base of the great mound served to prove that it owed its construction to the people who had founded the city, which Nimrud is the remains. There was a tradition current amongst the Arabs that strange figures carved in black stone still existed amongst the ruins, but we searched without Layard searched for them in vain during the greater part of a day in which they were engaged in exploring the heaps of earth and bricks covering a considerable extent of country on the right bank of the Tigris. It has a footnote. A memoir on their visit to the ruins by Mr. Ainsworth would be found in the Journal of the Royal Geographic Society, Volume 11. He gives a fuller account of the places when he describes the excavations and discoveries which he subsequently made there. At the time of their visit, the country had been abandoned by the Bedouins and was only occasionally visited by a few plunderers from the Shamar or Anizatines. They passed the night in the jungle which clothes the banks of the river and wandered during the day undisturbed by the tribes of the desert. A Koras, who had been sent with them by the Pasha of Mosul, alarmed at the solitude and dreading the hostile Arabs, left them in the wilderness and turned homewards. But he fell into the danger he sought to avoid. Less fortunate than themselves, at a short distance from Calah Shigat, he was met by a party of horsemen and fell a victim to his timidity. So maybe they killed him. Were the traveller to cross the Euphrates to seek for such ruins in Mesopotamia and Chaldea as he had left behind him in Asia Minor or Syria, his search would be vain. The graceful column rising above the thick foliage of the myrtle, ilex and oleander, the gradines of the amphitheatre covering, and he goes on and on about that.